The first time Mayor Richard Tarter looked at me, I was standing in the hallway outside his office, holding a folder full of zoning variance applications that needed his signature. It was a Tuesday in late September. I remember the light coming through the windows at that low angle that only happens in autumn, chestnut amber rectangles across the linoleum floor like stitches on a honey. I was 29 years old, 3 months into my position as a junior administrative coordinator at Hartfield County Hall, and I had no idea that the next 4 years of my life would unfold in ways I couldn't have imagined, couldn't have predicted, couldn't have fathomed even in my most fevered dreams. I had grown up in Hartfield, not the charming, prosperous Hartfield of today that was the creation of the mayor's vision and the developer's money, but the old Hartfield, the one that existed before the marina renovation and the downtown revitalization project and the glossy tourism campaigns. My father had worked 31 years at the Hartfield textile mill before it closed in 2008. My mother had cleaned offices at night and volunteered at the public library on weekends. We lived in a 3-bedroom house on Elm Street that my parents bought in 1987 for $43,000, and I shared a room with my younger brother Derek until I left for Thornwood State University at 18. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. Not a prestigious institution, Thornwood was a public school, the kind that accepted anyone with a post and a high school diploma, but I graduated with honors in public administration, and I came home to Hartfield with a degree and a plan. The plan was simple: get a government job, work my way up, prove that the people from the other side of the tracks could compete with the old guard families who had been running the county since before anyone could remember. The reality was different. The reality was a cubicle in the basement of County Hall, processing permit applications and answering phones and being invisible. My supervisor was a man named Gerald Moss, 63 years old, who had been doing the same job since 1995 and had no intention of ever doing anything else. He treated me with a polite, distant courtesy that made it clear I was both new and temporary, someone who would either leave or settle in, and either way, none of his concern. I was not temporary. I was not going to settle. But Gerald Moss didn't know that yet, and neither did I, not really. Not until Richard Tarter. The first time Mayor Richard Tarter looked at me, I felt something shift, not in the room, not in the building, but in me, in the way I understood my own place in the world. He was 57 years old at the time, in the 13th year of his tenure as mayor, and he had the kind of presence that made smaller men seem like children. He was tall, about 6'1", with silver gray hair that was still fit at the sides, and the kind of posture that comes from decades of commanding rooms. His suit was charcoal, impeccably cut. His eyes were pale blue, and when they settled on me, I felt something move in my chest that I had no name for then but would come to understand intimately over the years that followed, the specific gravity of art and how it bends everything around it. "Angela Hayes, right?" he said, pausing with his hand on the breast door handle. My personnel file was open in his other hand. He must have been reviewing it, or maybe someone had fleshed it for him. I would never know which. "I see you went to Thornwood State. Public administration. Graduated with honors." "Yes, sir," I said. My voice sounded strange to me, thin and too young. "I have the variance files you asked for." He took the folder from my hands. Our fingers brushed. His were warm, dry, deliberate, a man who knew exactly what he was doing at all times. "Tom by my office at 4, he said. "I want to go over this with you personally." That was how it started. Not with a grand gesture, not with some salacious come on in a dark corner, not with champagne and lies and the predictable machinery of seduction. Just a brush of fingers and a request to go over paperwork. If I had known then what I know now about Richard, about myself, about the way power operates in places like Hartfield County where everyone knows everyone and secrets are the local currency, I would have walked the other way. I would have taken those files to his secretary and never looked back. I would have transferred to a different department, or a different county, or a different career entirely. But I didn't know. I was 29, stuck in a mid-level administrative role that felt like a waiting room for my entire life, and Richard Carter was the most influential man in Hartford County. He had been mayor for 12 years. He knew state legislators, county commissioners, developers who wanted to reshape the county's eastern waterfront. He has survived 2 recall attempts, a federal audit, an extendo involving a deputy chief who turned out to be taking bribes from waste management companies. He had upnested 3 county administrators, 2 police chiefs, and an entire generation of politicians who had come into office promising to clean up his administration and left with their reputations in tatters. Being noticed by him felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. It felt like being chosen. And in Hartfield, where your origins determined your ceiling and the same families had been running the same institutions since the county was founded, being chosen by Richard Carter was the only ladder most people would ever have. At 4 o'clock, I walked into his office. It smelled like espresso, an old ladder, and something else, something expensive and settled that I couldn't identify. He was sitting behind a massive oak desk, the kind that probably came with the building, and he gestured for me to sit in the leather chair across from him. The chair was deeper than I expected, and I sank into it, feeling suddenly very young and very small, like a child who had wandered into the wrong room. "You went to Thornwood State," he said, not a question. He had my personnel file open in front of him. "Public administration. Graduated with honors." I did. I tried to keep my voice steady. "It was a long time ago." "It's never a long time, Angela. Credentials matter. They just don't always get used the right way." He closed the file and leaned back. The letter creaked under him. "I've been watching the way you handled the planning committee minutes. You caught 2 numerical errors in the last quarterly reports that the senior staff missed. You're thorough. You're careful. And frankly, you're wasted where you are." I didn't know what to say. Compliments from the mayor were not something that happened to junior coordinators. People like me were background figures, the ones who filed the paperwork and answered the phones and faded into the walls of the institutions we served. We were not praised. We were not noticed. We were not told we were wasted. "Thank you, sir. I just do my job." That's exactly the problem. He smiled, and it changed. His face softened. The hard edges around his jaw made him look almost warm, almost kind. People who just do their job never get anywhere. You have potential, real potential, and potential, in this county, is a crime to waste. I left his office that day with my head spinning. I walked back to my cubicle in the basement, past Gerald Moss, who didn't look up from his computer, past the water cooler where 2 women from accounting were having a conversation that stopped the moment I approached, past the window that looked out on the parking lot with its neat rows of cars belonging to people whose lives were more settled, more certain, more secure than mine. I told myself it was nothing. A politician being collegial, maybe even paternal. Richard Carter was old enough to be my father. He had children my age, I would later learn, at universities with names like Duke and Georgetown. This was surely just the kind of mentorship that powerful men were expected to provide to promising young professionals. It was probably even routine, the way the county's internal culture worked, a pipeline from the top down to the next generation of leaders. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way he said my name, Angela, 2 syllables that sounded different in his voice, like they belonged to someone more important than the woman who lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with thin walls and drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the rear fender. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had closed my personnel file with the air of a man who had already decided something and was merely waiting for the appropriate moment to announce it. The appropriate moment came sooner than I expected. Within a month, everything changed. It began with a departmental reorganization. The county was consolidating its planning functions, merging what had been separate offices into a new community development department. The change was announced as a cost-saving measure, but I knew from watching the way these things worked that reorganizations were rarely about money. They were about power, about who got moved where, who got promoted and who got sidelined, who ended up owing favors and who ended up collecting them. I was promoted to assistant to the director of the new department, a significant step up, with better pay and actual policy work instead of permit processing. The title was Assistant Director of Administrative Services, which sounded important even if I wasn't entirely sure what it entailed. My direct supervisor was a woman named Deborah Porter, 52 years old, who had been running the old planning office for a decade and who was being retained as deputy director under a new director named Harold Simmons, who had been brought in from a neighboring county with a reputation for aggressive development. Deborah was puzzled when she saw the announcement. She pulled me aside in the break room the morning after it went up on the internal bulletin board. The brick room smelled like burnt coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. She spoke in a low voice, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "Angela, this doesn't make sense," she said, her voice careful, her eyes searching my face. There were two other candidates with more seniority. Marcus Webb has been here 11 years. Patricia Otonko has a master's degree in urban planning. You have a bachelor's and 3 months. What changed? Mayor Carter recommended me personally, I said. And the moment I said it, I saw something flicker across Deborah's face, weariness, maybe, or recognition. She looked at me the way you looked at someone who has just stepped onto a frozen lake, someone whose next step could be either perfectly safe or catastrophically wrong. "Angela," she said slowly, each word placed with deliberate precision, "Richard Carter doesn't do things for free. You understand that, right? He doesn't spend political capital on junior employees out of the goodness of his heart. If he's backing you, it's because he sees a return on that investment. The question is what kind of return he's expecting." I told her I was sure it was just professional recognition. I told her I didn't know what she was implying. I told her I was grateful for the opportunity and I intended to prove myself. I told myself a lot of things in those first few months, and most of them were less. Love quiet, forbidden midlife romance. Subscribe to Noise Awakening for more slow burn stories. By December, I was attending county budget meetings that junior coordinators never sat in on. I was corresponding directly with state officials on development grant applications. I was being invited to planning commission dinners where the guest list was carefully curated and the wine was always excellent, a Burgundy for the appetizers, a Bordeaux for the main course, and a digestive that I never could identify but which always left the table in a good mood. I was being groomed. I understand that now, with the clarity of hindsight, with the bitter clarity of someone who has lived through the aftermath, for a role that would make me visible, indispensable, and above all, loyal. Not loyal to the county, not loyal to the department, not loyal to any abstract principle of good governance. Loyal to him, Richard. Never being caught in the act of anything, never doing anything that couldn't be explained away by coincidence or necessity or the anonymous authority of institutional process. He never called me at odd hours. He never cornered me in empty hallways. He never sent me messages that could be saved and shown to someone else. Everything happened in plain sight, under the plausible cover of mentorship, under the protective camouflage of 100 other interactions that looked exactly the same. He praised my work publicly, in meetings where other people could hear. He introduced me to key stakeholders, the president of the County Developers Association, the editor of the Hartfield Herald, a state legislator who was visiting to discuss infrastructure funding. He told people I was one of the most capable young professionals in the county administration. He said it the way a man might describe a particularly promising horse he was thinking of entering in an important race with pride, yes, but also with a proprietary satisfaction that went beyond simple recognition of talent. And all the while, the things he said to me in private were building something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with career advancement and everything to do with the raw, uncomfortable mechanics of desire. It was after the December holiday party, the one the county throws every year in the grand ballroom of the Hartfield Inn, with its chandeliers and its strings of fairy lights and its bar that ran on an open tab until the budget ran out, that he first kissed me. The party was winding down. The crowd had seemed to the truly committed, the ones who used these events as networking opportunities and couldn't bear to leave while there was still someone important in the room. I was standing near the east windows, looking out at the parking lot covered in fresh snow, watching the village struggle with frozen door handles, when Richard came to stand beside me. "You look like you're 1,000 miles away," he said. His voice was low, pitched for my ears only. "I'm just tired," I said. "It's been a long month. It's been a long year." He turned to face me. The ballroom was nearly empty. The string quartet had stopped playing 20 minutes ago, and now the only music was the patting variety from ceiling speakers, something soft and anonymous. "And I want to tell you something, Angela. I need you to hear it, and I need you to not be afraid of it." My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could see it. Could see the pulse jumping in my throat, could see the flash spreading across my chest above the neckline of my dress. I was wearing a black dress I had bought specifically for this party, something I never did, a dress that cost more than I usually spent and which I had chosen, I realize now, because some part of me knew that Richard Carter would be there, and some part of me wanted him to notice. "I've watched you this year," he said. "I've seen the way you think, the way you carry yourself, the way you handle pressure. You're extraordinary. And I've done things for you, career things, opportunities, because I believe in you. Not because I want something in return. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel something for you," she said plainly. No trembling, no dramatic pauses, no theatrical uncertainty. He was a man who was used to saying exactly what he meant and watching people rearrange themselves around it. He was a man who had spent decades at the center of a gravitational field that bent the trajectories of everyone around him, and he had grown so accustomed to the mechanics of that gravity that he no longer distinguished between what he wanted and what he could make happen. "Larry Tartar," I started, but he raised a hand. "Richard," he said. "When we're alone, it's Richard. Richard." I could hear my own voice, sing and uncertain, like a stranger's. "You're married?" "Yes," he said. "I am. And am your employee." "Also yes." She didn't blink. She didn't look away. He held my gaze with the steady confidence of a man who had never been refused anything he truly wanted, and who had therefore never learned how to handle rejection. "I don't expect anything from you, Angela. I'm not that kind of man. I would never ask you for something you didn't want to give. But I needed you to know how I felt. That's all. Now you know." He kissed me then. Not hard, not aggressively, not with the desperate urgency of a man who was afraid the moment would pass. Gently, with a kind of deliberate tenderness, like he was making a point. Like he was showing me something, not just his desire, but his certainty. The certainty that this was happening, that it would continue to happen, that I was already inside a story he had been writing for months and only now chose to reveal. When he pulled back, his eyes were steady on mine. "Think about it," he said. "There's no rush. There's never a rush with me, Angela. I always get what I want, but I prefer to get it in a way that makes everyone feel like they chose it." He walked away and left me standing by the window, my lips still tingling, my mind a ratchet of justifications. I said, the snow was falling steadily, coating the cars in the parking lot in a fresh layer of white that would be gone by morning, melted by the county's budget constraints and the salt trucks that couldn't be everywhere at once. The murmurs that followed were slow, seductive unraveling lights watching a knot that has been carefully tied over years of practice slowly loosening itself, thread by thread, until the rope falls away and whatever it was holding together is free to scatter in the wind. I told myself I would maintain boundaries. I told myself the promotion was genuinely merit-based, that his attention was paternal, that the kiss was a mistake we would both move past and treat as an aberration, a glitch in the system that would be patched and forgotten. I went to work. I did my job. I sat in meetings and took notes and smiled at Harold Simmons when he asked for updates and tried not to look at Richard Carter when he walked past my office door. But Richard Carter had planted a seed, and he knew exactly how to water it. He found reasons to meet with me. Always plausible, always deniable. Dinners at out-of-the-way restaurants where nobody from the county would see us, a place called Salvatore's on Lot 9, tucked behind a gas station, with checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles and a menu in Italian that I couldn't read and didn't dare to. Working late in his office with the door locked while snow piled against the windows and the building hummed with the sounds of empty offices and forced air heating. Drove through the countryside on Sunday afternoons in his black Escalade, talking about Tompi politics, about my future, about everything and nothing, while the autumn trees burn red and gold along the highway and the radio play odes from a station that only came in clearly in certain values. He was witty. He was brilliant. He had a way of making me feel like the most interesting person in any room, and when he touched me, always carefully, always in ways I could have pulled away from, always with enough space for me to retreat if I chose it, Southlight being chosen. Not selected at random, not bumped to the head of the line through bureaucratic accident, but chosen, wanted, seen. I knew his wife. Her name was Elena. She was a tall, elegant woman in her late 50s who ran the Hartfield Arts Council and was rarely seen at county functions. She preferred the city's cultural events, the gallery openings and theater premieres that required a 40-minute drive and a certain kind of audience. They had been married for 28 years. They had 2 grown children, a son named James who worked in tech in Seattle, a daughter named Tiffany who was in law school in Chicago. Richard spoke about Eleanor with a kind of courteous distance that I now recognize as a red flag, a warning sign painted in a color only visible in retrospect. But at the time I thought it meant he was simply a man whose marriage had become a comfortable arrangement rather than a passionate partnership, a man who had outgrown his wife in the way that successful men always seem to upgrade their wives, moving at a different speed, living in a different world, needing a different kind of company. I thought I was different. I thought I was the exception, the one woman who could match him, who could understand the weight of his decisions and the loneliness of his decision and the particular hunger that comes from being the most powerful person in a room full of people who need something from you. I thought our connection was real. I thought what he felt for me was different from whatever mechanical satisfaction he got from the other people who orbited him, the contractors and the commissioners and the development lawyers and the lobbyists. I was wrong. I was catastrophically, comprehensively wrong. What was I to him? I asked myself that question many times, usually late at night when I couldn't sleep, staring at the ceiling of my apartment while the neighbors thought about something through the thin walls. A younger woman, a pretty distraction, a tool, an investment? Or was I, impossibly, the thing I was most afraid to admit to myself, someone he actually cared about, someone he actually wanted, someone whose existence in his life was not purely transactional but carried some weight of genuine feeling? I let myself believe it, the last one. It's the most dangerous thing a person can do, not the cynicism that protects you, but the hope that blinds you, the desperate optimism that insists that this time, this situation, this powerful man must be different, must be the one who actually loves you. He didn't. But it took me a very long time to understand that. Love quiet, forbidding midlife romance. Subscribe to Noise Awaiting for more slow-burn stories. In March, Richard called me into his office and told me he wanted to nominate me for the position of Deputy Director of Community Development. The current deputy, a man named Thomas Greer, was planning to retire in July after 22 years of service. Thomas was a good man, quiet, competent, utterly without ambition, and he had been waiting for this promotion for so long that he had stopped believing it would ever come. Now, suddenly, it was mine to take. It's a big step, Richard said. He was standing by the window, looking out at the courtyard where the first crocuses were beginning to push through the soil. Spring in Hartfield was always tentative, always a false promise that could be cancelled by a late frost or an Arctic wind from Canada. It would put you on the administrative ladder. You'd be running your own department within 5 years. I'd need to go before the county commission, I said. My voice was steady, but my hands, folded in my lap, were trembling. They'll want to know why I'm being fast-tracked. I've only been in this department for 7 months. They'll know you're the most qualified candidate. I'll make sure of it. There it was again, that casual, confident assertion that he would make sure. Of course he would. Richard Carter had been reshaping Hartfield County to his liking for over a decade. The county commission included 3 members who owed their seats to his political organization. He had funded their campaigns, called in favors from their supporters, made calls to the party leadership when necessary. The county attorney had once been defended by Richard's personal law firm when he faced a misconduct accusation that should have ended his career. The newspaper, the Hartfield Herald, was owned by a developer who had received 3 major zoning approvals under Richard's tenure and who understood, with the clarity of a man whose fortune depended on it, exactly what kind of coverage was expected. Richard Carter did not operate in a political vacuum. He was the vacuum. Everything in the county's political ecosystem had evolved to fill the space he occupied, to orbit around him the way planets orbit a star, not by choice, but by the inescapable logic of gravity. And people will talk, I said. They already talk. About us. Richard's expression didn't change. He had been dealing with talk his entire career. There had been rumors about him and various women over the year, none of which had ever stuck, none of which had ever been proven, all of which had been eventually absorbed into the general background noise of small-town politics, where everyone knew everyone and every affair was both a secret and an open secret. What do you mean, people talk? I've heard things. I felt heat rise to my face. Whispered in the hallways. Looks. Linda from accounts made a comment about the mayor's new favorite. I didn't understand what she meant at first, but after a while I started to see the way people looked at me when I walked into rooms. Let's say I already knew something. Linda Kowalski was a 57-year-old woman who had been managing county accounting systems since before Richard was mayor. She was sharp, observant, and utterly without illusions about the people she worked for. The comment she made, interesting how the mayor's new favorite always gets the best assignments, had been delivered in the break room, within earshot of at least 4 other people, with the casual cruelty of someone who had stopped caring about office politics years ago and now simply said whatever she wanted. Richard's response was immediate and smooth. Linda from the town says a bored woman with too much time and not enough imagination. She's been making comments like that about every woman who gets promoted for the past 15 years. Anyone who matters knows that you're here on merit. Anyone who doesn't know that isn't worth worrying about. It was a masterclass in reframing. He took my anxiety, the perfectly reasonable fears that my career advancement was being interpreted as payment for sexual favors, the fear that everyone in the building was judging me, whispering about me, seeing me as a woman who had traded her dignity for a promotion, and he made it sound like weakness. Like I was the one being unprofessional by caring about appearances. Like the problem wasn't the affair, but my own insecurity about it. And the thing was, I believed him. That's what he did. He believed himself so completely, with such absolute certainty in his own narrative, that everyone around him started to believe him too. Richard Tarter had been rewriting his own story for so long that he had forgotten there was any difference between the story and the truth. The hearing was in April. I sat in the county commission chamber wood panel room with high ceilings and portraits of past mass on the walls, including one of Richard himself, painted in oils and hung in a place of prominence after his 10th anniversary, and I answered questions from 5 commissioners about my background, my vision for the department, my understanding of zoning law and community planning. They asked me about my academic credentials, my management philosophy, my plans for the department's relationship with the county's development community. I had prepared exhaustively, stay up late 3 nights in a row to review every relevant document I could find. Richard sat in the back row, hands folded, watching me with an expression of benevolent confidence, like a father at his daughter's school play. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence in the room was statement enough. Anyone who mattered understood that Richard Carter's endorsement was the only endorsement that mattered, and that opposing his candidate would have consequences that no ambitious politician would want to risk. They approved my nomination unanimously. As I walked out of the chamber, past the reporters and the curious onlookers and the other candidates who hadn't made the cut, Richard caught my eye and smiled. That evening, for the first time, we crossed a line we couldn't uncross. He took me to a private room at an Italian restaurant outside of town, a place he apparently maintained for this kind of invitation, with curtains drawn and a server who asked no questions and a wine list that seems to have been curated by someone who considered anything under $100 to be beneath consideration. We drank a full bottle of Montepulciano. We talked. We laughed. We traded stories about our childhoods, his in a wealthy suburb of New York, mine in a working-class neighborhood in Hartford, 2 worlds that had almost no overlap except here, in this room, across this table. And when he put his hand on my knee under the table, I didn't move it away. I didn't move anything away. I let him take me, piece by piece, transaction by transaction, until I couldn't remember what I had looked like before he started removing parts of me. After dinner, we drove to a bed and breakfast in the next county. It was a spring night, cool and wet, and a kind of quiet that only exists in rural places, the silence of crow in distant fields, of wind moving through trees that had been standing for centuries, of stars emerging over farmland that had been producing crops since before the country was founded. The BUD was called Willowbrook Manor, and it had the slightly faded elegance of a house that had once been grander wallpaper that was beginning to peel at the seams, heavy curtains that smelled of lavender and thyme, a staircase that creaked in the middle in a way that felt less like a structural flaw and more like a character detail. In the room, I stood by the window and looked out at the dark trees, and I felt his hands on my shoulders. His breath was warm against my neck. "Are you sure?" he asked. It was the last time he would ever ask. I turned around. Yes, it was not love. I know that now, with the clarity of someone who has had 4 years to examine the wreckage and sort through the debris. It was the transaction reaching its natural conclusion, the investment maturing, the returns coming due, the implicit contract becoming explicit. But in that moment, in that room with the low lamplight and the old furniture and his hands moving across my skin with the practiced confidence of a man who had done this before and knew exactly what he was doing, it felt like something else. It felt like parts, like I had suddenly gotten hold of something that mattered. Like I had stopped being the girl from Elm Street who would spend her whole life processing permits in a basement and had become, at last, someone who could look Richard Tarter in the eye and hold her ground. I didn't know that the ground was made of sand. Love quiet, forbidden midlife romance. Subscribe to Noah's Awakening for more slow burn stories. Her name was Christine Barlow, and she was 46 years old. She was also, as I would learn in the most brutal way possible, not the first and not the only. Christine worked as a paralegal at the Hartfield County prosecutor's office. She was introduced to Richard as a county Republican fundraiser in the autumn of our first year together. I know, because Richard told me, with the casual candor of a man who has never had to guard his secrets because no one around him has ever been in a position to use them. By Christmas, she was receiving favors, her boyfriend's DUI charge quietly reduced to a misdemeanor by a prosecutor who owed Richard a considerable debt, her brother's zoning variant thus tracked through the department I now ran, a small business loan from a county-backed lender who somehow found room in his portfolio for an application that should have taken 6 months to process. By February, she was meeting him at the same Willowbrook Manor on Wednesday afternoons while I thought he was at regional planning meetings in the state capital, sending documents and making phone calls and pretending to be a man of the people while his hands were on someone else's body in a room that smelled of lavender and old wood. I found out by accident. A misplaced invoice, a charge from Willowbrook Manor on a Wednesday in February, paid on a county procurement card that had been assigned to the mayor's office for emergency accommodation services. It was my job, as deputy director, to review and reconcile procurement card expenses. The cards were meant for legitimate county business, hotel rooms for out-of-town meetings, meals during emergency situations, that kind of thing. I had been trying to clean up the procurement system, to make it more transparent, to reduce the number of gray area charges that everyone knew happened but no one ever acknowledged. The invoice was for $247. Room, dinner, and a bottle of champagne. I filed the charge, queried it with the finance department, and received a response that sent me code. The card was assigned to Richard's driver, a man named Paul Sullivan, who had been driving the mayor for 15 years and who was known for his absolute discretion. The charge was for a room at Willowbrook Manor for the night of February 14th. Sagittary 14th, Valentine's Day. I sat in my office with the printout in my hand and felt the floor drop out from under me. Not because I thought Richard was faithful, I knew better than that. I was not naive, not anymore, not after 18 months of being the woman he came to when he was bored or stressed or feeling young. But there is a difference between knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your body, the way you feel a physical blow. There is a difference between understanding that a man is using you and accepting that you are, in fact, being used. I confronted him that evening. I had never confronted him about anything before. I always let him set the terms, the pace, the narrative, the acceptable bounds of what we were to each other. But this was different. This was my dignity, or what was left of it. This was the last piece of the self I had been trying to protect, the part of me that still believed I had chosen this, that I was not simply a recipient of his choices but an active participant in my own loss. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He listened to me with that same calm, unreadable expression he wore during commission hearings, that same mess of controlled authority that made it impossible to tell what he was actually thinking. When I finished, my voice shaking, my hands clenched, Tears I refused to let fall, he spoke. "Angela, you're the most important person in my life," he said. "You have to understand that. She's a complication. She's become needy and possessive in ways that I didn't anticipate. She started to demand things, to call the office, to make comments to people who might repeat them. She's become a liability. But what we have is different. What we have is real. You understand that, don't you? You understand that I would never risk what we have for someone who doesn't matter." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him so badly. Because it's what we had was real, that maybe the career advancements, the promotions, the fast track, if those were just the backdrop, the incidental context, the material circumstances surrounding something genuine, then my choices were defensible. Then I wasn't just a woman slipping her way up the ladder. Then I was something more. Then there was a story I could tell myself, a story in which I was not a victim but a participant, not a pawn but a player, not a satellite orbiting Richard Carter's gravity but a planet in my own right, making my own terraces about my own orbit. "Ended with her," I said. "Ended completely. Today." He promised he would. He lied. Over the next 2 years, I learned the architecture of Richard Carter's duplex the way you learn the layout of a house where something terrible happened. Every room has a meaning, every shadow holds a memory, every piece of furniture is a reminder of what you lost and what you allowed to be taken from you. There was Christine, who he kept at arm's length after I pushed back, who became increasingly volatile and eventually left her job and moved to Cleveland after a confrontation with Elena that nearly ended everything. There was a woman named Dana from the State Tourism Board, tall, blonde, with the kind of perfect bone structure that looked airbrushed even in person, who had received a consulting contract with the county, worth $80,000 the same year she began appearing on Richard's calendar with suspicious frequency. There was a county commissioner, female, divorced, ambitious, with her eye on the state legislature, who had received his endorsement in that tight primary race in exchange for what I could only guess at, because Richard never told me and I never asked. And there was me. Through all of it, there was me. Priming, pushing back when I could, but mostly just riding the current, telling myself the next promotion would be the last one, the next achievement would justify everything, the next year would be different. I would end it. I would find a way out. I would rebuild my career on my own terms, without his shadow over every achievement, without his fingerprints on every document. But the truth was, I had been changed. I had been remade in his image, or at least in the image of what he wanted me to be: complaint, discreet, hungry enough to stay but afraid enough to never ask for more than he offered. I had let him build me, and now I didn't know how to exist outside of the structure he had constructed. Eleanor found out about us in June, 3 years after that first kiss by the window. Christine had written Richard a letter, an actual handwritten letter, which Eleanor must have found among his things in the house. They still showed a letter detailing every encounter, every favor, every lie, written in the desperate scroll of a woman who had finally understood that she was never going to be more than what he allowed her to be. Christine mailed copies to the county attorney, to the editor of the Herald, and to each member of the county commission. I was in my office when my assistant knocked and told me the mayor wanted to see me. I knew then. I could see it in her face, the careful blankness, the averted eyes, the way she was holding her notepad like a shield. Richard's office was a crime scene of controlled panic. Papers everywhere, the letters, I assumed, Eleanor's evidence laid out like a prosecutor's exhibit. He was standing by the window. He spoke to me, looking out at the courtyard where the summer flowers were in full bloom, riotous and careless and indifferent to the catastrophe unfolding inside. When he turned around, I didn't recognize him. The mask was down. The composed, confident, always certain Richard Carter was nowhere to be seen. What was left was a man who had been running for a very long time and had finally been caught. "Elena's gone," he said. His voice was flat, mechanical, like he was reading from a script. "She took the kids' photos and the photo albums and she laughed. She filed for divorce this morning. And these letters," he held up a manila envelope. "They're everywhere, Angela. The Herald is running a story on Friday. The state attorney's office is opening an investigation." I sat down. My legs wouldn't hold me. I had been preparing for this moment or something like it for 3 years, running through scenarios in my head during sleepless nights, imagining what would happen when the secret finally came out. But no amount of preparation had readied me for the actual sensation of watching a man's empire crumble in real time and understanding that I was part of the robbery. "We need to get our stories aligned," he said. Christine described things, specific things. "We need to agree on a timeline, on what was view and what wasn't, on how we characterize our relationship, what the public can know versus what actually happened." "Our relationship," I repeated. The words sounded absurd in my mouth, like a punchline to a joke I hadn't realized I was part of. "Yes, our relationship." He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something new in his eyes, not anger, not calculation, but something closer to fear. Not fear of me, but fear of what was coming, the same fear that lives in every animal when it realizes the trap has closed. "For God's sake, Angela, focus. This isn't about us. This is about survival." But I couldn't focus, because in that moment, looking at Richard Carter, the man who had reshaped my career, my ambitions, my sense of what was possible, I saw him clearly for the first time. Not as a mentor or a lover or a powerful protector or any of the 100 different stories I had told myself about who he was and what we meant to each other. I saw him as he was, a man who had built a system of extraction and had been extracting from everyone around him for so long that he had forgotten there was anything else, including me. Including the fact that I was a person and not a ledger entry in whatever internal accounting system he used to keep track of his power, his favors, his endless accumulation of control. "We're not aligning anything," I said. My voice was steady now. Something had crystallized in me, some final, irreversible understanding that changed the chemistry of everything. "I'm not tolerating for you. I'm not lying to investigators. I'm not your character witness, Richard. I'm not your fall guy. I'm your mistake." He stared at me. For a long moment, I thought he might actually hit me. The physical expression of the rage I could see building behind his eyes, the decades of authority meeting, for once, with an absolute refusal to bend. The thought didn't frighten me as much as it should have. I was past fear. I was past everything, past the desperation that had driven me into his orbit, past the hunger for his attention, past the desperate need to believe that this had been worth it, that I had been worth it, that somewhere in this transaction there had been something real. "Angela, if you go against me on this, your career is over. You understand that, right?" His voice had changed, lower, harder. The voice of the man who had always gotten what he wanted by making people understand the consequences of refusing him. "Everything I've built for you, everything we've built. You built it," I said. "I was just the building." I walked out of his office and down the long hallway of County Hall, past the offices of the people who had whispered about us, past the commission chamber where I had testified about my qualifications and my vision for the department, past the window where Richard had first told me I was extraordinary, a word I now understood to be the most dangerous word in his vocabulary, because it meant nothing. It meant anyone. It meant whatever served his purpose in the moment. I walked out the front door and into the June sun, and I stood on the steps and breathed air that tasted like tight grass and freedom, and I understood that the woman who had walked into this building 4 years ago, naive, ambitious, desperate to be seen, was already gone, had been gone for a long time, and that the woman standing in her place would have to build herself from the ground up, with no favors from powerful men, no shortcuts, no transactions, just her own hands, just her own name. Love quiet, forbidden midlife romance. Subscribe to North the Waiting for more slow burn stories. The Herald story ran on Friday as expected. It was worse than I imagined. They had Christine's letter in its entirety, 12 pages of single-spaced allegations, detailing dates and locations and favors and promises made and broken, every lurid detail presented with the gleeful precision of a newspaper that had been waiting years for an opportunity to take down the man who had owned it, as well as a statement from Elena confirming that she had discovered evidence of multiple extramarital relationships and that she and the mayor had been separated for 3 weeks, ever since she had found the letter in his home office and understood, with the clarity of a woman who had been married for almost 3 decades, exactly what kind of man she had been sleeping beside. They did not name me explicitly in the first edition. The editor, a man named Mitchell, who had owed Richard so many favors over the years that his newspaper existed in a state of perpetual indebtedness, was protecting me, or protecting himself, or protecting whatever delicate arrangement still existed between the Herald and the people who ran the county. My name didn't appear until page 6 of the Sunday edition, in a paragraph noting that a county official who had received significant career advancement during Richter's tenure was cooperating with investigators. I spent that weekend in my apartment. I didn't answer the phone. I didn't check my email. I sat on my couch with the curtains drawn and watched the light change through the fabric, morning to afternoon to evening, a slow clock of ordinary time marking the distance between who I had been and who I was about to become. The state attorney's investigation took 8 months. During that time, I was placed on administratorily paid, technically, but a form of Excel, a way of removing me from the public eye while the county figured out how to contain the damage. I sat in my apartment and read the Herald's coverage, the daily updates, the editorial opinions, the letters to the editor from citizens who had always suspected Richard Carter was corrupt and who were now being vindicated in their suspicions, and I waited for the other shoe to drop. Richard resigned in September. It was a quiet resignation announced at a press conference that lasted exactly 12 minutes, during which he expressed his profound regret for the pain and distraction he had caused his family and his constituents, and announced that he would be stepping back from public life to focus on personal matters. He was replaced by an interim mayor, a colorless county supervisor named Martinto, who had never held higher office and who was chosen specifically because he posed no threat to the existing power structure. Richard's departure was reported with a mixture of standardized satisfaction and grudging acknowledgement of his decades of service to the county. The Herald ran a retrospective piece that mentioned his stormy personal life in one paragraph and his enduring legacy of infrastructure investment and downtown revitalization in the next, as if these two facts existed in separate universes and could not possibly be related. Eleanor divorced him. The settlement was reported to be substantial. She got the house, half his pension, and what I later heard was a modest but significant sum that was nevertheless more than enough for her to maintain the lifestyle she was accustomed to travel, to fund her arts council projects, to build a new life in a coastal town I never learned the name of. She moved there in October, after the leaves had turned and the summer people had left, and that was the last I heard of Eleanor Carter. Christine Barlow moved to Cleveland and sent me a friend request on Facebook 6 months after the story broke. Her profile picture showed a woman who looked exhausted, older than her 46 years, with none of the glossy confidence I remembered from the one time I had seen her at a Tony event. I looked at her profile for a long time, her posts about starting over, about finding peace, about learning to trust again. I didn't accept the request. I wasn't angry at her. She was as much a victim of Richard's system as I was. A woman who had been told she was special and had believed it and had suffered the consequences of that belief. But I didn't want to be reminded of that version of myself, the woman who had measured her value in promotions and proximity to power. I didn't want to be in a position to compare notes, to trade stories, to become part of a community of women who had all been wounded by the same man and had found, in that wounding, a kind of teamship. Some kinships are not worth having. It's been 4 years since I walked out of Richard Tartar's office for the last time. I'm 38 now, and the years have changed me in ways. I am still cataloging the gray hairs that started appearing after the investigation ended, the new lines around my eyes that no amount of sleep will risk, the particular wariness I carry into every new interaction with a man who has any kind of authority over my life. I lived in a one-bedroom condo now, nothing grand, but mine paid for with my own salary, with the mortgage I applied for and received on my own merits, with no help from any man who expected something in return. The building is quiet. The neighbors keep to themselves. There is a community garden on the corner where I sometimes sit in the evenings, watching the tomatoes grow, thinking about the distance I have traveled and the distance I still had to go. I drove the same Honda Civic, though I had it painted last year, the dent in the rear fender filled and repainted, the car looking almost new, or at least newer than it had been in the years when I was driving it to motel parking lots and bed and breakfasts, and the back entrances of restaurants where powerful men kept private rooms. I sometimes think about that car as a kind of timeline, a record of everywhere I went and everything I did. The miles on the odometer are an autobiography of the kind, the story told in distances traveled and destinations reached, and the particular loneliness of highways at night. I've been dating a man named Paul for 7 months. He's a high school biology teacher, honest, unassuming, entirely uninterested in politics. He has never made more than $60,000 a year. He has never once offered to use his connections to help my career, because he doesn't have connections, and because he would never think to. He grading papers at the kitchen table on Sunday nights. He has a collection of vintage science fiction novels that he refuses to lend to anyone because he is particular about their condition. He laughs at his own jokes before he finishes telling them, and sometimes he forgets to finish them at all. He is not impressive in any of the ways that Richard Carter was impressive, and that is precisely why I trust him. When I told him I had been deputy director at Hartfield County, that I had been involved with the mayor, that I had been caught up in a scandal that made national news, that I had lost everything I had dealt, I expected judgment. I expected the tearful distance that people put between themselves and other people's disasters, the polite withdrawal that is the modern way of saying I don't want to be contaminated by your failure. I expected him to make an excuse and leave early and never call again. He made dinner. He held my hand across the table. He said, "That sounds like a really hard thing to survive. I'm sorry you had to go through that." And I realized, sitting at his small kitchen table in his modest house with his cat asleep on the windowsill and the smell of garlic and other vile in the air, that I had finally found the thing Richard Carter could never give me, a relationship with no ledger, no accounting, no cost-benefit analysis. Just two people trying. Just two people who wanted to be together because being together made their lives better, not because one of them has something the other needed. I think about Richard sometimes. Not with longing, I want to be clear about that. I don't miss him. I don't fantasize about running into him, about some grand confrontation that would give me the chance to tell him exactly what I think of him and watch the mask finally crack for good. That kind of thinking is a trap, a way of staying tethered to a story that has already ended. What I feel is closer to what a patient might feel toward a surgeon who saved their lost but left a scar, gratitude and damage, graded together so tightly it's impossible to separate them. He did things for me that I will never fully account for. He opened doors I could never have opened on my own. He showed me, in the most painful possible way, exactly what I was capable of accepting from another human being, and that knowledge has been, against all odds, a kind of gift. Because the thing you know cannot hurt you the same way twice. The thing you have survived cannot take you by surprise. He remarried last year. A woman 20 years younger than him, a local news anchor with a smile that looked like it belonged on a cereal box and a figure that suggested she understood exactly what kind of transaction she was entering into. The Herald covered the wedding, a society piece, 2 full pages, with photographs of the reception at a waterfront estate and quotes from county officials wishing the couple well. They called it a fairy tale ending, as if fairy tales were things that happened to men like Richard Tarter, as opposed to the women who believed in them. I wanted to write a letter to the editor correcting their vocabulary. I wanted to point out that there are no fairy tale endings for the women who get used and discarded in these stories, that the only ending that matters is the one you build for yourself, slowly, patiently, brick by brick, with no shortcuts and no powerful friends. I didn't, of course. I just kept living my quiet, ordinary, honest life. I got my senior planner certification. I started volunteering at a women's career resource center on Saturday mornings, helping women in their 40s and 50s navigate job searches and workplace politics, women who had taken time off to raise children, or who had been laid off from jobs they had held for decades, or who were trying to re-enter a workforce that had changed beyond recognition since they last participated in it. I helped them with their resumes, their interview skills, their salary negotiations. I tell them the truth that power is seductive, that powerful men will use you if you let them, and that the only ladder worth climbing is the one you build with your own hands. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that girl standing in the hallway outside Richard Tarter's office, holding a folder of zoning variance applications, watching the autumn light come through the windows and thinking, for the first time in her life, that something extraordinary was about to happen. I want to reach back through time and tell her, you are not extraordinary because a powerful man says you are. You are not your title, your salary, your proximity to power. You are not the promotions you receive or the offices you are permitted to enter or the hand that chooses you from across a crowded room. You are the choices you make when no one is watching and everyone is watching. And the most important career move you will ever make is the decision to never, ever sell yourself short. But she wouldn't have listened. I know that. Because nobody does. Because the seduction of being chosen by someone who can change your life is a gravity that pulls even the strongest people off their feet. Because hope is a kind of blindness, and desire is a kind of madness. And the pull of possibility is almost impossible to resist when you have spent your whole life watching other people live the lives you were told you deserve. I survived it. Not an state, not an art, but hope. And that is the only promotion that ever really mattered. The 8 months of administrative leave were the longest of my life. Not because of the isolation, though the isolation was its own kind of torture. The days bleeding into one another with no structure to mark them, no meetings to attend, no purpose to give them shape. What made it longest was the waiting, the not knowing, the slow, excruciating process of waiting for a verdict that could either restore my life or destroy it entirely. I had plenty of time to think. Too much time. The human mind is not built for extended solitude with its own thoughts. And I found myself revisiting every decision I had made since that September afternoon when Richard Tarter first looked at me. I replayed the scene in his office, the first meeting, the way I had felt when he said the word extraordinary. I traced the path backward, through every escalation, every compromise, every moment when I had chosen the easier answer over the harder truth. I wanted to find the moment where I could have made a different choice, the off-ramp I missed, the branch in the road that led somewhere else. But the more I looked, the more I realized there was no single turning point. There were dozens, hundreds. Every small decision I made to accept what he offered, to believe what he said, to trust that he meant well when all evidence suggested otherwise. The investigators interviewed me 3 times. The first interview was the most terrifying. A small room in the state attorney's office, 2 investigators across the table, a recording device that hummed softly in the corner. They asked me about my relationship with Richard. They asked about promotions, about the favors he had done for me, about any official actions I had taken that might have been influenced by our personal relationship. They asked about Christine Barlow and Eleanor Carter and the web of women that Richard had constructed over the years. I told them everything, not because I was brave, I was terrified, but because I had made a decision in Richard's office that day, the decision to stop lying, and I was not ready to start again. The truth came out in fragments at first, hesitant and careful, and then in a flood, like water breaking through a dam. I told them about the first kiss at the holiday party, about the night at Willowbrook Manor, about the promotion and the hearing and the county procurement card, about Christine Barlow and what I had discovered and how Richard had responded. I did not hold back. I did not minimize. I gave them every detail I could remember, even the ones that made me look worst, especially those ones, because I understood, finally, that the only way out was through, and through meant telling the truth no matter how much it hurt. The second and third interviews were follow-ups. The investigators had found corroborating evidence, records, testimonies, the paper trails that Richard had been too confident to properly conceal. Christine Barlow had been collating wisdom since before Eleanor's letter became public, providing details, dates, evidence. Eleanor herself had given a deposition. The case against Richard was built not from my testimony alone but from a constellation of sources, a pattern of behavior that stretched back decades and implicated at least a dozen other people, developers, commissioners, county employees, in a system of favors and reciprocity that had defined Hartfield County politics for as long as anyone could remember. The investigation cleared me of wrongdoing. That was the official finding, that while I had engaged in an inappropriate personal relationship with the mayor, there was no evidence that I had exchanged sexual favors for official action, that I had misused my position, or that any of my career advancements were the direct result of anything other than the mayor's general favoritism toward promising young staff members. It was a narrow escape. A technicality, some said, but I knew what it really was, the truth emerging at last, and the truth being enough. When the administrative leave ended, I was reassigned, not to the deputy director position that had been filled by a man named Taylor Forces, a career administrator who had been imported from a neighboring county specifically to stabilize a department that had been through too much publicity. I was given a position as senior planner mid-level, with decent pay and meaningful work, but nothing like the authority I had grown accustomed to. Nothing like the office with the window, the staff who reported to me, the sense that I was building something that mattered. I took the job. What else could I do? I was 34 years old, with a career that had been derailed by scandal, a reputation that would follow me for as long as I worked in county government, and a set of choices that I could not undo no matter how much I wished I could. The job was a chance to rebuild. It was a chance to do work that was honest and meaningful, work that I could point to and say, I did this on my own. No Richard Carter. No shortcuts. No transactions. The first months were hard. Not because of the work was familiar, almost comforting in its routine, but because of the people. The way they looked at me, the whispers that followed me down hallways, the careful distance that my colleagues maintained, as if my stench were contagious, as if proximity to my bad decisions might damage their own reputation. Linda Colosti from accounting was the first person to treat me normally. I ran into her in the break room one morning, 8 months after the story broke, and I braced myself for the kind of comment she had made before, the cutting remark, the knowing look, the reminder that everyone remembered what I had done and would never let me forget it. Instead, she poured herself a cup of coffee, looked at me with eyes that had seen too much politics to be suppressed by anything, and said, "Water cooler talk is just nice, Angela. The people who matter know you did your job. The rest is just people who don't have anything better to talk about." I didn't know what to say. I stood there with my coffee cup in my hand and my throat tight, and I managed to say thank you, and she nodded and walked away, and that was the entire conversation. But it mattered. It mattered more than I could have articulated. It was the first time someone who knew the full story had treated me like a person instead of a cautionary tale. Paul and I met at a bookstore. This is the kind of detail that sounds invented, too neat, too much like the beginning of a romantic comedy rather than the setting act of a life that had already been marked by one catastrophic affair. But it is true. I was in the fiction section of the Thorwood Book Barn, an independent store that had been operating out of the same brick building since 1974, and I was reading the first page of a novel I wasn't sure I wanted to buy when he appeared at the end of the aisle and asked if I had read the author's previous book. His name was Paul Denton, 41 years old, a high school biology teacher at Forwa Central, which was the same school I had attended as a teenager, though he hadn't started teaching there until years after I graduated. He was tall and slightly stooped, with reading glasses that he wore on a chain around his neck and a habit of pushing them up on his forehead when he was thinking. He had been married once, for 4 years, in his late 20s, and the worst scenes: no children, no drama. His ex-wife had left him for a man she met at a yoga studio, which he told me about with the wry resignation of someone who had long since made peace with the absurdity of it. We talked for an hour about food. It was the most ordinary conversation I had ever had with a man I was attracted to. There was no electricity, no gravitational pull, no sense that I was standing at the edge of something that could sweep me away. There was just a man talking about books, asking questions, and actually listening to the answers. I didn't tell him about Richard Carter on our first date, or our second, or our fifth. I told him on our 6th date, over dinner at his house, pasta with a simple tomato sauce, a bottle of wine that cost $12, a movie we have watched because we were too busy talking. I had been building up to it all evening, the way you build up to something painful at the dentist's office, knowing it will hurt less if you just get it over with. "I have to tell you something," I said, "before this goes any further." He put down his fork and looked at me. "That sounds serious." "It is." I took a breath. I used to work for Hartfield County, in community development, and I was involved with the mayor, the former mayor, the one who resigned a few years ago. Paul didn't say anything for a moment. He picked up his wine glass and took a sip and set it down, and I watched his face, trying to read it, looking for the shattering, the retreat, the polite excuse to end the evening early. "The scandal," he said finally. "Not a question." "Yes. The scandal where there were all those women, and what's left, and the investigation." "Yes." He was quiet again. Then he said, "That sounds like it was a really complicated situation." It was. My voice was unsteady. I was 34. I had just been promoted to deputy director, and the mayor, he helped me with my career, with everything. And I like him because I thought I convinced myself that it was real. "Was it?" Paul asked. His voice was gentle, without judgment. Was any of it real? I thought it was. That's the worst part. I really thought it was. We sat in silence for a long time. The candles on the table had burned down to puddles. The poster was getting cold. I was waiting for him to make an excuse, to say he needed to get up early, to gently explain that this was more than he had signed up for. Instead, he reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm sorry you went through that," he said. "It sounds like you survived something really hard." That was it. That was all he said. No interrogation, no demands for more details, no visible recalculation of my words as a partner based on the contents of my past. Just compassion, simple and uncomplicated, offered without condition. I cried. I don't cry easily. I hadn't cried during the investigation, or the administrative leave, or the reassignment, or any of the 100 small humiliations that followed me through those years. But I cried then, sitting at Paul Denton's kitchen table with my pasta getting cold and my hand in his, because he had given me something I hadn't realized I needed. The experience of being known and not rejected. 4 years later, I am still learning, still unlearning, still figuring out what it means to be a person who made terrible choices and then survived them, who was used by a powerful man and then found her way back to something like ordinary life. I have learned that forgiveness is not a single act but a daily practice. I forgive myself a little bit each day for the choices I made, and each day I have to recommit to that forgiveness because the voice in my head that reminds me of my failures does not take weekends off. The voice is quieter now than it used to be, but it is still there, and I have learned to distinguish it from the voice that tells me I am making good choices now, in the present, with the information I have. I have learned that love is not the gravitational pull I once mistook it for. It is not the feeling of being chosen by someone powerful, being noticed by someone important, being the object of someone else's desire. It is quieter than that. It is two people choosing each other, over and over, in small ways and large ones. It is Paul remembering that I prefer my coffee black and making it that way without being asked. It is me learning the names of his students and asking about them by name. It is 1,000 small acts of attention, accumulated over time, building something that neither of us could build alone. I have learned that the women who are most vulnerable to men like Richard Carter are not weak or naive or greedy, as the culture so loves to suggest. They are ambitious. They are hungry. They are willing to work hard and sacrifice for advancement, which are qualities we claim to admire in men but punish in women. We call women who want power grasping, manipulative, willing to use their bodies as currency. We do not ask why the system is built in such a way that these choices feel like the only options available. We do not examine the men who build these systems, only the women who navigate them as best they can. I have learned that surviving something does not mean you emerge unscathed. It means you carry what happened with you, in your body, in your habits, in the way you approach new relationships and new opportunities. I am more cautious now than I used to be. I am slower to trust, slower to commit, slower to give anyone the benefit of the doubt. These are not bad qualities. They have probably saved me from making similar mistakes again. But they are also armor, and armor is heavy, and sometimes I wonder what I might have been able to do if I hadn't needed to wear it. Last month, I was offered a position as Director of Planning for the city of Thorwood, a significant promotion, the kind of opportunity one would have done anything to get 5 years ago. The hiring committee was impressed by my record, my references, the quality of my work over the past 4 years. No one mentioned Richard Tarter. No one asked about the scandal. They looked at my resume and my portfolio and my interview performance and saw what I had done, not what someone had done for me. I accepted. I will be the first person in my family to hold a directorial position at any level of government. My father, who died 3 years ago, never got to see it. My mother, now 73 and living in the same house on Elm Street, cried when I told her. My brother Derek, who runs an auto repair shop in Ohio and has never quite understood what I do for a living, sent me a text message that said simply, "About time." The job comes with an office with a window, a staff of 12, and a salary that will allow me to pay off my tonder 5 years early if I'm careful. It comes with respect, which is worth more than money. It comes with the knowledge that every piece of it, every promotion, every project, every achievement belongs to me and no one else. I think sometimes about what I would say to Richard Tarter if I saw him again. We haven't crossed paths since his resignation. He lives in the southern part of the state now, with his Saturn ward, far from Hartfield and its memories. I don't seek him out. I don't follow his life in the news. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my new office with the windows open and the spring air coming in, I think about the man who changed my life, and I try to find something like gratitude for what he taught me. Not gratitude for the affair. Not gratitude for the corruption or the lies or the years I spent being used. But gratitude, perhaps, for the clarity. For the moment when the trap closed and I understood, for the first time, exactly what kind of machine I had been feeding all along. For the moment when I looked at Richard Carter and saw him clearly, not a mentor, not a lover, not a powerful protector, but a predator who had built his life around the systematic exploitation of people who wanted something he could provide. And who is to say that clarity is not its own kind of gift? There is a question that comes to me at 3 in the morning, when the world is quiet and the defenses are down. It comes when I am half asleep, drifting in that space between consciousness and dream where the mind is most honest, most unguarded, most likely to surface the things we work so hard to keep submerged. The question is this: would I do it again? Not the affair. I had made my peace with the affair, or at least I had made a kind of truce with it. The way you made a truce with an enemy you can never fully defeat. Not the corruption, or the lies, or the slow, grinding process of becoming someone I did not recognize. The question is more specific than that, more personal. Would I, knowing everything I know now, knowing how it ended, knowing what it tossed, knowing the shape of the wreckage I would have to navigate through to find my way back to something like a last, would I, is given the chance to go back to that September afternoon, walk into Richard Carter's office and refuse him? The honest answer is that I don't know. I want to say yes. I want to believe that the person I have become, the one who volunteers at career resource centers, who cooks breakfast with Paul on Sunday mornings, who has learned the difference between power and love, would have had the strength to walk away. But I also know that the person I was at 29 was not the person I am now. She was younger, hungrier, more desperate. She came from a world where being noticed by someone powerful felt like a gift, not a trap. She did not yet know what it would cost her, because she had never been in a situation where the bill came due. I think about the version of myself that never met Richard Tarter, the Angela who stayed in the basement cubicle, processing permits, fading into the walls of the institution she served. The Angela who was still with Gerald Mouth, still invisible, still waiting for a break that never came. The Angela who might still be there now, in that same cubicle, if she had been lucky enough or wise enough, or simply cautious enough to avoid the trap. Which last is better? Which Angela is more sweet? The woman who was used and discarded but emerged with hard-won wisdom, or the woman who was never used at all but also never forced to confront the depths of her own compromises? I don't have an answer. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe the question itself is the point, the recognition that every choice we made carries within it the shadow of the choices we didn't make, and that living with our decisions means living also with their alternatives. I wrote Richard Tarter a letter once. This was during the 8th month of the ministry to leave, when I had nothing to do but think and wait and try to understand what had happened to me. I wrote it in the middle of the night, sitting at my kitchen table with a bottle of wine I never opened, and I wrote it with the kind of raw, unfiltered honesty that only comes from a certain kind of desperation. The letter was not a love letter, though it contained love, the complicated, residual love that survives the destruction of the thing it was attached to. It was not an accusation, though it contained accusations. It was not a goodbye, though it contained that too. It was, I think now, an attempt to make meaning out of something that had none, to find a narrative shape for an experience that had felt, at the time, like puretés, a series of events that had happened to me without my consent, without my understanding, without any logic I could discern. In the letter, I told Richard what he had done to me. Not the facts, he knew the facts, had left them, had orchestrated most of them, but what he had done in a deeper sense. How he had taken my ambition and my hunger and my desire to be seen and had weaponized them against me. How he had looked at a young woman who wanted something legitimate, career advancement, recognition, the fair shot she had been promised by every myth about meritocracy, and had decided that her wanting was an invitation. How he had offered me the ladder and then, once I started climbing, had used the ladder, had to increase his own power over me. How he had made me complicit in my own exploitation, so that even now, even after everything, part of me still wondered if maybe I had been the one using him. I told him that I hated him, and then I told him I forgave him, and then I told him I didn't know which one was true, and that maybe both were, and that this contradiction was the most honest thing I could say about what had happened between us. I never sent the letter. I read it back to myself the next morning, in the gray light of day, and I understood that sending it would be a mistake, not because it wasn't true, but because it was. Because sending it would give him a response he didn't deserve, would reopen a door I had spent too much energy closing. Richard Tucker did not need my forgiveness. He didn't want it. He had moved on to his second wife and his new love, and my letter would have been nothing to him but a minor annoyance, a leftover artifact from a chapter he had already closed. So I kept the letter, and then, a year later, I burned it. I laid a match in the kitchen sink and watched the paper curl and blacken, and I thought about all the things we carries that we never need to show anyone, all the words we write that are only ever meant for ourselves, all the conversations we have in the privacy of our own minds that would change nothing if they were ever spoken aloud. The burning felt like an ending. Not a dramatic one, not the kind of ending you see in movies, with wailing music and a final, meaningful glance. Just a quiet ending, the way most endings actually are. The paper turned to ash and I washed the sink and went to bed, and in the morning I woke up and started the next chapter of my life, the one that didn't have Richard Carter in it. That was the real ending. Not the scandal, not the investigation, not the resignation. The burning of the letter. That was when I knew I was going to be okay. It is October now. The leaves in Thornwood have turned the way they always do, the maple going first, a blaze of orange and red, followed by the oaks with their deeper, darker palette. I am sitting on the porch of Paul's house, the one he owns, the one that is slowly becoming ours even though neither of us had said the words that would make it official. He is inside making breakfast. I can hear the sound of the pan on the burner, the hiss of butter, the radio playing something soft and old-fashioned. I think about the woman I was at 29, standing in a hallway in Hartfield County Hall, holding a folder of zoning applications and believing that the most important thing in the world was to be chosen by someone powerful. I think about the woman I became at 34, walking out of that building for the last time, understanding that the only ladder worth climbing is the one you build yourself. And I think about the woman I am now, at 38, sitting on a porch in Thornwood with a cup of coffee and a man who makes me feel that ordinary life is the most extraordinary thing in the world. The screen door opens. Paul comes out with 2 plates, eggs, toast, bacon, the kind of breakfast that used to seem impossibly domestic to me, The kind of lives as that I had given up when I chose to pass that LED to Richard Carter. He sets the plates on the table between us and sits down in his chair and picks up his coffee and looks at me with an expression I have come to know well over the past 7 months. Uncomplicated affection, the kind that asks for nothing and offers everything. What are you thinking about? He asks. Nothing, I say. And then, because he deserves more than nothing, I'm thinking about how good the eggs look. He smiles. They're from the farmer's market. The woman who sells them remembered me from last week. She asked if I was coming back. Are you? Every Saturday, he says. She gives me the discount for regulars. This is the life I had built. X from the farmer's market. Saturday mornings. A man who has a standing relationship with the woman who sells sex. Small rituals, small commitments, small buildings of other lives that is shared and ordinary and completely, utterly real. I take a bite of toast. The butter is cold. The coffee is hot. The morning is cool and clear and full of possibility, the way every morning is when you have finally stopped running and started living. It is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything.